drugs, or ideas, what you consume influences who you become. On the Mind and Matter podcast, we learn together from the best scientists and thinkers alive today about how your mind-body reacts to what you feed it. Before starting Mind and Matter, I spent 10 years in academia doing scientific research. I got a PhD in neuroscience where I focused on neuroendocrinology and the neurobiology of behavior, and before that, I specialized in molecular, developmental, and evolutionary genetics. I use my scientific background to help parse and translate the information that guests share on the podcast. In addition to the podcast, I write long-form written content inspired by the show where I integrate what I've learned across episodes. I also have a free weekly newsletter where I provide you with upcoming guests, share links, and provide commentary on scientific studies and research that I'm reading, and more. Visit mindandmatter.substack.com to find all of my content. You are about to listen to the full episode, but there will be 1 to 2 short ads immediately following this before the conversation. If you would like to hear ad-free episodes and get early access before they release more widely, become a paid subscriber at the Mind and Matter Substack at mindandmatter.substack.com. Becoming a paid subscriber is a way to directly support my efforts, allowing me to make more episodes and higher quality episodes, and also helping to free up my time so that I can spend more of it on doing research and synthesizing results from the podcast and from the literature so that I can do more things like writing on the Substack, putting more content into the newsletter, and getting these things out more frequently. So if you want to support the show and get ad-free episodes, go to mindandmatter.substack.com. Hey everyone, a great way to support my efforts is to visit my support page at mindandmatter.substack.com. A link to that page is in the episode description, or you can search for it on the Substack page itself. The support page has an up-to-date list of my affiliate partners. These are companies I work with, and if you buy those products through those links or using the discount codes provided, those will get you a great deal on a variety of products related to optimizing physical, metabolic, or mental health and vitality. These are all products I use myself, and some of them are directly related to podcast episodes or formulated by Mind and Matter guests. For example, there's a great product called Keto Citra, formulated by a kidney biologist who is on episode number 186. It contains the ketone body BHB together with several minerals in a precise ratio formulated with kidney health in mind. There are also links to products like physical technology devices to track your metabolic health, digital applications to help you find and learn about food and consumer products, and more. One product I use every day is the AquaTrue water filter. I recommend this to everyone because it gets everything out of your drinking water: heavy metals, microbes, endocrine disruptors, microplastics, you name it. Other charcoal or gravity-based filters that a lot of people use don't get everything out, they just get some of the stuff out. So I really like the AquaTrue product. You can look for a link to my affiliate partners on my support page or directly in the episode description to this episode, or you can go to mindandmatter.substack.com to find it there. Stephan van Vliet, thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Nick.
Do you want to start off at the beginning here, just telling everyone a little bit about who you are and what your lab does?
Yes, so I'm the director of the Center for Human Nutrition Studies at Utah State University. And our work is heavily focused on linking food production systems to the nutrient density of food. So we do both work in field work, working with a lot of agricultural producers, food companies. And we're particularly focused on how do different production practices or different cultivars or different processing methods impact the nutritional quality of food. And we particularly go beyond just the surface level of macros and vitamins and minerals, and also looking at phytonutrients and bioactives and what sometimes people refer to as the dark matter of food, basically the other 99% of nutrients or metabolites that are in food, but they do not appear on your nutrition facts panel, but as we're learning, they are probably pretty important for our health, even though they're not per se essential. And so we do a lot of nutrient density profiling. And then the other pillar of our work is that we also perform randomized controlled clinical trials. So we also have a clinical facility in the Center for Human Nutrition Studies where we feed people these foods and then take usually their blood, urine, and stool to look at their effects on things such as the gut microbiome, their circulating metabolome, things like their cholesterol profiles, right? HbA1c, glucose, insulin, so basically general biomarkers of health.
Yeah, so you guys sort of look at everything, or everything that we can look at based on what our instruments can do. And this is an important point just in the abstract, because people are used to buying food at the store. They look at the nutrition facts, and the nutrition facts have information on them, but it does not have everything by any means. There's a lot more to it than just the basic macros and the vitamins and minerals people are used to seeing on those labels. There's obviously a lot more inside of our food that we might know something about, but it's not on the label, or even we don't even really know anything about it in terms of what it does.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, I would say like even though we, annotate or quantify maybe, routinely at about 1,000 compounds within our lab that we at least scan for, but um, it is, I think that we're still sort of looking at the tip of the iceberg here. It's like we descended from the summit. We're a little bit lower now, but we're definitely not all the way down when we look at this on terms of the complexity. So maybe we went from 1% to 5% or 10%, which is still a big leap. But yeah, we're still learning this. And I sometimes think of this, especially in the field of we look at a lot of phytonutrients, which are things like polyphenols and other things like flavonoids would be a major class of polyphenols, or simple phenols, alkaloids, and other terpenes, other plant secondary metabolites. Especially in the context of plant foods, these are very important. But what we're also finding is that animals consume plants and transform these into different metabolites, and we get exposed to these as well through the plant selection of the animal, which often may select plants that you and I would otherwise not be able to consume because we cannot digest them, and we found some medicinal compounds in that as well. But if we take a look at it from a perspective of plant source foods, they're typically not that high in calories, right? They're pretty low in protein, pretty low in carbohydrates. Well, why do you eat a blueberry? You typically do so for the anthocyanidins, right? And various other flavonoids. And it's really there where we've been trying to understand how does blueberry A differ from blueberry B, based on, for instance, especially with a big focus on growing practices. And then also, when humans eat these, what are some of the metabolites that become bioavailable in humans? And how do they impact our health? I mean, generally within layman's terms, these things are considered antioxidants, but they have much broader effects than that, where they can directly impact, for instance, pancreatic beta cells. There's some indication that they can impact things such as the mTOR pathway, which is related to protein synthesis. They can even cross the blood-brain barrier, where they may have some neurocognitive effects. So yeah, these are really some of the things that we're trying to understand. And then, as I mentioned, particularly, how can we potentially increase those within our foods that we eat? Because besides that, they're also flavor compounds, these flavonoids, right? So if you have a blueberry and it has a much stronger flavor, or you have a carrot that has a much stronger flavor, it typically means it has more of these what we consider health-promoting compounds in them.
Well, one of the things that everyone's talking about right now, because it just happened, is this new food pyramid that came out. And, we don't need to dissect that completely or anything, but one of the salient changes is that things that used to be on the bottom of the old pyramid are now at the top of the new one. In other words, they sort of switched up what you're supposed to eat the most of. And it used to be, the bottom of the old food pyramid was grains, carb-rich foods, things like that. And now the equivalent part of the new food pyramid, the top, the things you're supposed to eat more of, very different stuff in this new food pyramid. One of the things that sort of changed its emphasis quite a bit between food pyramid 1 and food pyramid 2 is meat. And I want to talk about meat for a number of reasons. It's really interesting. There's different types of meat. There's also a lot of confusion and there's a lot of like linguistic differences in terms of how people use terms around meat. And I want to talk in particular with you, based on what you do and what you've studied, about red meat. And people use the term red meat all the time. It's it's a colloquial term. People use it even if they're not scientists. And people use it in very different ways, in my experience. So I want to start off by just asking you the basic question. What is red meat exactly in terms of your definition and the scientific perspective on this? What's red meat as opposed to other types of meat?
Well, I mean, other types of meat, when people usually think of red meats, they think of well, as the color would suggest, red meat that is rich in hemoglobin, right, or myoglobin in the context of muscle. Um, Most meat is red meat. I mean, even in it's maybe it's an interesting sidebar. Wild chickens are pretty red as well. Duck also red meat, right? But and wild boar, wild pigs also pretty red. So most meat is would be considered red if it wasn't for us perhaps intervening in this. But most of the things we think of is like things like beef, lamb, right? I would consider pork a red meat as well. Goat. I mean, people consume all kinds of different meats across the world, right? So that's what we would consider red meat in general, yeah. But in most of the context that we consume it is mostly from ruminant meats, and in the Western diet, beef.
Yeah. So one lens to look at this through is literally the redness, which would correspond to the amount of hemoglobin, basically how much blood was in that particular meat tissue. Another way to look at this, or sort of an overlapping way, and this is where it gets confusing because people kind of use these terms in different ways or have different criteria. You said ruminant meat, and I want to talk a little bit about what that means. So what are ruminant animals as opposed to non-ruminant animals?
Well, I mean, we have like ruminant animals. Again, if we just look at the cow for chambered stomach, um, so ruminants, I mean, their metabolism is slightly different in the sense that compared to maybe, well, we don't really consume it. We consume it maybe in Europe, but horse meat, for instance, which is more of a hindgut fermenter. But yeah, in terms of ruminant meats, what we typically see in the ruminant can consume mainly plant material that is very high in cellulose and other to us, and maybe monogastric indigestible matter. And that's really what differs a ruminant from a monogastric. Granted, there's a little bit of exceptions. Recently, we studied, for instance, grouse, which is a wild bird, but it is capable also of consuming things like leaves from aspen trees and other, sagebrush and things that are very high in tannins that might be toxic normally, but the animal can detoxify it quite well, so to its digestive tract. And but in general, ruminant meats, yeah, these are things like beef, goat, lamb, that are for chambered stomached animals. And like I said, the uniqueness of them is that they can consume plants that you and I would otherwise not be able to access.
Got it. So a ruminant is an animal with a multi-chambered stomach. Basically, when people say like cows have multiple stomachs,
Yeah.
this is what they mean. It's a ruminant animal. It's got a digestive apparatus that's set up differently from other creatures like us. We've got one stomach. And it sounds basically like the ruminants tend to be strict herbivores. They eat lots of plants, probably different types of plants. They can eat plants that creatures like us cannot eat. Non-ruminants, I'm imagining, are more likely to be omnivores. So maybe they're not eating the same plants as the ruminants. Maybe they're not eating strictly plants or as many, but this multi-chambered stomach digestive configuration is different in ruminants compared to non-ruminants. And that is allowing them to digest and to eat different types of plant material.
Yeah, that's right. Different types of plant material that a monogastric oftentimes cannot digest, and a lot of it has to do with, for instance, high cellulose content, which the plant wall being in such a structure that monogastrics, such as humans and potentially also other animals, cannot digest it. Now, not all monogastrics are per se omnivores. You could think of things like, let's think, for instance, of the grouse, right, or pheasant, that would be mostly consuming plant material. If you look at, for instance, things like chickens or duck, they would in the wild definitely consume a good amount of bugs as well.
Got it. So, there's a Venn diagram here. The ruminants are basically plant eaters, period. Cows eat grass, that type of thing. The non-ruminants are more likely to be omnivores, but there's some examples of ones that eat mostly plants. And then there's also just like practical considerations, like a wild chicken or a pasture chicken is going to be eating anything it can get its hands on, basically from plants to bugs and stuff. But in practice, many raised chickens and things like this might only be given by humans a plant-based diet.
Yeah, that's right. That's why your eggs would say vegetarian fat. And I always kind of chuckle because I prefer like my chicken to be omnivorous, because that's what they would normally consume, right? So, but yeah, that's the case in omnivore. You tend to have more flexibility. Yeah.
So, and you kind of study all of this stuff. So, what is in different types of foods? What's in different types of meats? What's in these different types of each, depending on what that animal was eating, and all of these things. We're going to dig into a lot of that. Staying on the topic of red meat, or I'm going to call it ruminant meat, things like beef from a cow. One of the big distinctions that people see in the stores and that a lot of people talk about is the difference between grass-fed and grain-fed beef and dairy products. So beef, meat, or dairy from cows that are eating grass-fed diet versus grain-fed diet. Let's just start out with grain-fed, and I want to make sure people understand that, because I think that's kind of the most common one that people are probably consuming. So when we say that an animal is grain-fed, what does that mean? And what are the grains that they're normally eating when we're buying meat from the store?
Yeah, so I mean, it basically refers to animals typically finished in confined feedlots, right? In confined animal feeding operations. And they're not fed 100% grains, but it's a total mixed ration. But that tends to be during the last few months of their finishing phase, tends to be anywhere from 60 to 80% grain. It depends on the type of a lot of it depends on availability, but by far the most dominant grain that is being fed to animals in confinement, from beef cattle, would be corn. But other things may also be fed due to their availability. It could be things such as distiller's grain is another commonly available byproduct. In some dairy systems, they might feed almond hulls, peanut shells, or but by far most common it is corn that is being fed to animals, and then that may make up 60 to 80% of the diet, and the rest would typically be considered roughage. It would be hay that is being fed, and then usually some sort of vitamin mineral supplement that is being fed as well as usually some products to ensure that the animal does not bloat, essentially. So that's usually also fed as part of the ration.
So cows can be fed different things. A lot of this probably has to do with convenience and efficiency, the cost of the materials, their availability. Corn is probably very common because we've got lots and lots of corn. It's relatively cheap. Obviously, if you're running a business and you're in the business of selling meat, you want to be as efficient as possible. What is sort of the purpose or the effect of finishing an animal with grain in terms of how it's affecting the tissues of that animal and therefore the product that humans will end up buying?
Yeah, I mean, the short enough is the reason why people do it, obviously, is because they gain weight much quicker because it's a high energy diet. So it's fattening up the cow, and we tend to pay for meat in terms of weight, right, and not so much in nutritional quality. Though I do want to highlight that we've done several studies with feedlot finished beef as well, and when consumed as part of a quote unquote healthy whole foods based diet, I would argue that grain-fed beef is a whole lot better than eating a Twinkie, and that may not come as a surprise, but that is important to note. But what we've also noticed is that when animals are out on pasture, feeding on a diverse mixture of plants, then you definitely get additional health promoting compounds that become incorporated into the beef. And you actually get quite a bit of differences when we run metabolomics analysis, where it's basically you look at a large number of compounds. We see about a 50% difference in the metabolite profile. So quite a considerable difference. And what we particularly see is that things like omega-3 fatty acids get enriched in the grass-fed beef, things like fat-soluble vitamins, like tocopherols and carotenoids, which can ultimately become vitamin A. We also see vitamin K and vitamin E to be enhanced. And then the other thing that we see enhanced is these metabolites that are coming from the plants, because the plants, those fresh forages, contain lots of polyphenols, lots of simple phenols, alkaloids, terpenes, and other plant secondary metabolites that the animal then incorporates within its body. And being a rumen, they often gets biotransformed into different products, but that still arguably maintain that antioxidant or anti-inflammatory effect. And so we can see in the animal that animals finished out on pasture, they do present with a metabolic profile that is I would argue, healthier. The animals are typically in better metabolic health. Doesn't mean that the animals in the feedlot are sick. I'm not per se implying that, but we do see a difference in their metabolome profile. And what we can clearly observe is that the animals out on pasture, they tend to present with a better mitochondrial profile. Their glucose metabolic control is better. So picture sort of this in the terms of, you can really see that in a human as well. Let's say a human that is maybe athletic, that has eaten a whole foods diet. That would be a comparable, I would say, to a grass-fed animal.
So we've got two factors here in terms of how cows are prepared for human consumption. One is the grass-fed, grain-fed distinction, and it's a different pattern of feeding throughout the life cycle of the animal. It's not that grass-fed necessarily is eating one and only one type of grass, and the grain-fed is eating one and only one type of grain its entire life. There's a bit more to it than that. But the other factor here is like feedlot versus pastured. And those two things tend to go together, or they're highly correlated, I would imagine, right? You always see grass-fed and pasture raised together because you just let the cows walk around in the pasture, which is made of grass, but they're just kind of out there eating whatever they want, whatever is growing in the pasture. And so it's going to be a variety of different grasses and things. And not only is their diet different, but just their lifestyle in general in terms of their movement patterns and things like that.
Yeah, that's right. So it's probably a twofold thing is that, and that's always hard to dissect out, because animals on pasture, they tend to also have an ability to engage in more innate behavior, right? They may move more, especially we're working with ranchers that move their cows quite often. Even some of them, especially here living in Utah and mountain pastures, would herd them through the mountains. And so these animals might easily walk 5 miles a day or something like that, right? So you get the physical activity piece as well. So especially when you look at things like their mitochondrial health, it's hard to separate that from their diet, because even they're probably eating more long-chain fatty acids, which preferentially get metabolized within the mitochondria. So their diet would probably enhance their mitochondrial health, but their physical activity can do so as well. And the same, for instance, with their glucose metabolic health. We often measure intermediates in the glycolytic pathway, and we see that the animals out on pasture present with what we would consider, at least in humans or lab mice or other species, right, a more favorable glucose metabolic profile or glucose metabolic health. But that obviously also would be because of their physical activity, but it also means because they're not eating these high concentrate based diets. So that essentially result in the animal to fatten up really well. And maybe the simplest way of just saying this is that, let's say if you have a human that you put on a very highly digestible, carb heavy diet, right? Versus a human that would be on now we talk about the food pyramid, right? Lots of greens and vegetables and things such as that. You present with a different, let's say a more Mediterranean diet versus a highly digestible carbohydrate heavy diet, right? You would expect to see a different metabolic profile, and you might expect that one person, the human, to gain more weight and maybe see some worsening of glucose metabolic factors. And, it's not per se to say that, that I don't want to imply here per se, and this is also not really, there's no strict standard on it, so I don't want to imply that we're giving the animals diabetes or anything like that. That's not the case, and it's also only 3-4 months. But you do see a difference in the metabolic profile, and if that's acceptable within society, right, because of efficiency, then it is what it is. But yeah, we do have a strong interest in studying those, and I would have to admit that the animals on pasture, yeah, they do present with an improved metabolic profile and with additional potentially health promoting metabolites. Now what we do know is that if you eat grass-fed animals, you can meaningfully raise the circulating omega-3 levels in your blood. We have found that by measuring omega-3 levels in people's red blood cells, and it actually raises quite a bit. It can make a meaningful contribution. So we know that. How that broader metabolome profile impacts our health, we really don't know at this point. Like, is eating grass-fed animals for 20 years, yeah, it exposes you to more of these health-promoting phytonutrients, typically a little bit more of these fat-soluble vitamins, more omega-3s. If that makes a long-term health effect, we don't know. And in randomized controlled trials, obviously they're typically not long enough to really look at that. But one thing that would be, I think, crucial to do in the field is that when we look at epidemiological studies, no study ever distinguishes between whether people are consuming meat from pastured animals or feedlot finished animals. And maybe the assumption could be that it's feedlot finished animals, right?
Yeah.
And then, but the other point that it also makes it difficult is that I would imagine that people are eating grass-fed animals, they're probably doing a bunch of other things beneficial for their health. They're eating more fruits and vegetables. They are more likely to smoke less, drink less, gamble less, higher socioeconomic status, right? All things that play into their health. But it would be a good thing to do, I think.
Yeah. So basically what you're saying is, and we're going to dig into some of this, there's a lot of differences between grass-fed and grain-fed cows. And even though it's all cows and it's all, you can eat a ribeye from a grain-fed cow, I could eat one from a grass-fed cow. We're eating, at one level, we're eating the same thing. We're both eating a ribeye steak, but actually they're quite a bit different in terms of what's inside of them and what my body's going to get out of them. And we'll dig into some of that, but you made a key point that I think we'll circle back to maybe later, which is most of the studies that have been done historically about food, about red meat, about beef, they sort of lump everything together and they don't make a distinction between where the meat came from, how it was prepared, and what the actual specific measured nutritional content of that meat was. Everything just kind of gets bucketed together as beef or even just red meat or whatever. And that, you can imagine that that's going to lead to a lot of confusing and maybe misleading results because there's a lot of these things are not all interchangeable.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, what's really interesting is also if you look at the epidemiological studies or even randomized controlled trials, most of the studies study red meat in the context of healthy diets, right? Mediterranean diets, Bold diets, Mind diet, Dash diet. These are all just whole foods-based diet, low in ultra-processed foods. And what you typically see there, even in randomized controlled trials, when people consume red meat as part of those diets, their metabolic health improves compared to their habitual diet or a control diet, which is oftentimes a standard American diet. So I think that is so key. And that's why I think it's so confusing. For instance, one really interesting is that red meat is consistently associated with diabetes. But if you look at it from sort of a mechanistic standpoint, it's hard to imagine why that is the case. Now, I know people have brought up that it promotes inflammation and advanced glycation end products, but what you see in randomized controlled trials is that if you feed red meat to people, you barely get an insulin response.
Right.
You barely get a rise in glucose. And most of the randomized controlled trials would find that people that eat red meat as part of healthy diets actually improve their glucose metabolic health. So that's one thing already that's very confusing. And then on top of that, it's also is that, like you said, no distinction between grass-fed and grain-fed, which we know are 50% different.
Right. Yeah. So again, we'll probably keep coming back to this, but you're saying they're 50% different. To put it in layman's terms, very big differences. It's not a tiny, subtle difference. It's a very clear, very distinct difference between meats that are coming from different sources, prepared in different ways. And most of the epidemiological literature, so the literature that tries to correlate what people are eating with health outcomes, lumps these things together into these higher level categories that probably lead to a lot of confusion and you gave one example, right? Red meat, some studies say red meat's associated with diabetes, but that doesn't make a lot of mechanistic sense. And then you start to think, well, they're just calling everything sort of red meat. They're not distinguishing between grass-fed, grain-fed, et cetera. And you quickly realize that a lot of these correlational studies that correlate nutrient content with what people say they ate, and it's not even measured usually. It's, just you ask someone, what did you eat last week? And they say beef. And that's sort of the end of the analysis that, gives you the numbers that feed into the study. If we're not making all these distinctions, we're not actually measuring things, we're going to be lumping and averaging things together that are actually very different from one another.
Yeah, and probably the caveat should be, or the extra part that should probably be added to the news headline is like eating red meat as part of a standard American diet is associated with diabetes or associated with heart disease, right? Because the overall diet in which you consume individual foods matters so much that, and there's actually some mechanistic evidence on that as well. looking at the food pyramid, right, that was turned upside down, quite literally. But there's actually some research to suggest that eating red meat, which may form things like advanced glycation end products or other potential carcinogens or potential carcinogens. I mean, that's a controversial topic as well. But red meat is labeled as a carcinogen by the health organizations, right? But what you actually see is that the formation of those products, those potential carcinogen products, if you marinate the meat, or you put a bunch of spices on the meat, or you eat it with other plant foods, that in simulated digestion models, the formation of those products might be decreased by 50%, 80%. So there's actually something to it, that if you're eating a ribeye with a salad or broccoli or, another whole foods-based diet versus maybe from a fast food outlet, that the response might already be different too, in terms of some of maybe the quote-unquote negative that you would get from that. And those are all such important nuances that, I mean, they are in the literature, but when you're painting with broad strokes, and typically that's how it's done in news articles or in just communication, those nuances are often missed. But I think when I look at the literature, I see that, yes, red meat may be associated with metabolic diseases in the context of a standard American diet. But then if you look at the literature, maybe it extensively adjusts for some of those other factors, like fruit and vegetable intake, like drinking, like smoking, etc. Or if you look at other populations where people actually consume red meat as part of healthier diets or randomized controlled trials, a lot of those associations or health concerns seem to become quite neutral, actually.
Yeah. So again, like, these things are not all interchangeable. How it's prepared, how the cow is prepared to get to the grocery store is going to change what's inside of it. How you prepare it in your home is going to further change it. Whether or not you're buying it from McDonald's or doing it in your home, is all of these things matter. And they're typically, when you see those headlines that say red meat is blank or red meat is associated with blank, they are lumping everything together from everyone. And they really have no idea what all of the individual people are eating in terms of the specifics. And yet we make these blanket statements, which, once you start to think about this and you realize these things, you realize that a lot of those statements are just vacuous. You can't actually make these conclusions. I want to ask you a little bit more about grass-fed versus grain-fed in general. I want to ask some macro questions and then some phytochemical questions. Let's start with the macros, because those are what people are more familiar with. In general, on average, it sounds like grain-fed animals are going to have higher overall fat content. So if you eat a ribeye from a grain-fed cow, it's probably going to have higher overall fat than a grass-fed pasture-raised cow. I want to ask you about the fat profile and the fatty acid profile. You've already given us sort of one hook into that, which is the omega-3s. But how does on average, typically, how does a pasture-raised grass-fed beef from a cow differ from a grain-fed animal in terms of its fatty acid profile?
Yeah, so you see differences both in the saturated fatty acid profile as well as monounsaturated and polyunsaturated. If you first look at the polyunsaturated fatty acids, you see more omega-3s. Essentially, that's also the main differentiator.
Mm-hmm. And what
you actually
in grass-fed
animals, yeah, contain higher omega-3s, right about threefold higher. So
omega-3s are what people would think of as like fish oil.
Yeah, things of fish oil. Yeah, but actually, and what's really interesting is that, and this is oftentimes, I think, another nuance is that what I often see on social media or just being communicated is that it doesn't matter that there's a little bit more omega-3s in grass-fed beef because it's so minor that it cannot contribute meaningfully. But this comes back again to sort of this reductionistic approach to nutrition, is that, and I would agree, if I look at an Excel spreadsheet and I'm looking like, oh, the omega-3s increased to 90 milligrams from 30, it's not that much, only 60 milligrams more. But then if you feed it to people, you actually get a stronger response than what you can determine from your Excel spreadsheet.
Right.
I think that comes back to the whole food matrix, that the food contains hundreds to thousands of metabolites that probably result in higher uptake of those omega-3s. Another hypothesis that we have, and that seems to be very plausible, is that a lot of the phytonutrients are antioxidants. So they prevent lipid peroxidation.
Right.
So you might actually get a stronger effect than what you would expect. If I give you 60 milligrams of maybe fish oil or something like, or, the equivalent of omega-3s in fish oil, or maybe another, just a DHA and EPA supplement, probably the effect wouldn't be as noticeable, would
Right.
be my hypothesis. And but when you get this into a whole food, 1 + 1 isn't 2, it's 3.
Right, right. And what you're saying here, this is an important point that a lot of people miss, especially a lot of armchair self-declared nutrition experts. The amount of mass in the food, which is what you're going to read on the nutrition label, it's not necessarily a good indicator of what your body's actually going to see, because what you're saying is the absorption, the digestion, the bioavailability, all of these things are context dependent. So if you've got 50 milligrams of omega-3 in food A and 50 milligrams, the same mass in food B, those two foods can differ in many other ways. So the matrix, the soup of stuff that you're actually going to be consuming might enhance or diminish your body's ability to absorb it in your GI tract. It might have antioxidants that prevent the fatty acid from being transformed chemically before it even gets into your cells and things like that. So that's basically what you're saying, right? All the stuff, you can't really think about these nutrients in isolation. You have to think about them, unfortunately, because it's more complicated, in the context, the food matrix that they're actually coming inside of.
Yeah, that's right. And I do appreciate that it's not something you can stick on the nutrition facts panel, that nuance, but it is important within dietary guidelines and within, sort of the communication to consumers that we highlight those things. And, another important thing, if we look at the saturated fatty acid profile, there's actually no difference in total saturated fat in terms of percentage of total fat. So you might have pick up a grass-fed beef and grain-fed beef, and you say, oh, it contains same amount of total saturated fat. But that saturated fatty acid profile will have shifted in grass-fed beef towards more longer chain saturated fatty acids, many of which epidemiological research would suggest that they are more neutral, or in some cases end up even beneficial to health. So you get the same thing that happens in the polyunsaturated fatty acids, where you get the shift towards more long chain fatty acids, you get a shift towards more long chain fatty acids in the saturated fat as well. So you might, at least what would appear on paper as a healthier saturated fatty acid profile. And we're currently writing up a paper where we fed people 16 weeks of all of their meats from pastured animals. So this was chicken, beef, pork, and eggs, versus the feedlot finished equivalents of those. And we actually found is that you can raise omega-3s, but we also found, at least in the subset of women, that with male and female participants, that in the females you could also see a drop in their LDL cholesterol as well. So which could play into that also, potentially, at least related to the saturated fatty acid profile that they consume.
So again, for better or worse, things are more complicated than we might like them to be. Even if you could even have identical saturated fat levels in two different meat products, but the saturated fatty acid profile, the specific types of saturated fats, could differ quite a bit between them, right? They have different lengths and they have different effects. There's lots of different saturated fatty acids. So they differ in their saturated fatty acid profile. They differ in their omega-3 polyunsaturated fat content and profile. The other one I want to ask you about is omega-6 polyunsaturated fat. So if we think of omega-3s as like the fish oil type fat, omega-6s are the ones found in seed oils and very common in processed foods. How does grain-fed versus pastured and grass-fed affect the omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acid profile of beef?
Yeah, probably not as dramatic as people think. So, because it's a little bit lower, about 30% lower, but it's really not the major driver. So it's really, grass-fed beef has a much lower omega-6 to 3 ratio of about 2-to-1. So 2 omega-6 molecules to 1 omega-3 molecules. In feedlot beef, it's about 8-to-1 to 10-to-1. But what is really driving that ratio is not because grain-fed beef contains so much more omega-6s. It is really that it contains much less omega-3s, or vice versa. Said differently, grass-fed beef contains much more omega-3s, and that's really what's altering that ratio, and not so much the omega-6s. They're actually they're statistically different in our profiling studies that we have done, but they're only 30% lower or so in grass-fed beef compared to grain-fed beef.
Got it. So grain-fed, grass-fed, they differ in their polyunsaturated fatty acid content. grain-fed animals, I'm guessing, have more overall polyunsaturated fatty acids. They have more overall fat, and they have a different omega-6, omega-3 ratio. But the difference is mostly due to a difference in the omega-3 content, more so than the omega-6 content.
Yeah, and you see more of a shift towards oleic acid as a monounsaturated fatty acid, and palmitic acid is also enriched. So you see a shift a little bit away towards more saturated and medium chain saturated fatty acids, as well as oleic acid. So it's not so much because you're wondering, well, where do the omega-6s then, or if it's low in omega-3s and it's not much higher in omega-6s, where do they go, or what are the other fatty acids that are enriched? And it's usually things like palmitic acid, and palmitic acid is more associated with impairments in metabolic disease. Now, another nuance to point out to that is that you produce a bunch of palmitic acid when you eat very highly digestible carbohydrates. So if you're eating as a human a bunch of sugar or refined grains, you have high palmitic acid, and that tends to also. So it could be the reason why palmitic acid circulating in our body is associated with metabolic disease, because you're eating a bunch of highly digestible carbohydrates. So again, it becomes nuanced, but we do see that, at least on paper and then in humans, we see this shaking out, that the more beneficial fatty acid profiles of grass-fed beef do seem to have a meaningful impact and a beneficial impact on our circulating fatty acid profile.
Okay, so bottom line, grass-fed, grain-fed beef will be very different, even if it's the same cut of meat. It's even going to be different if you've got a ribeye that's grass-fed pastured versus grain-fed, you could cut that up in home so that you're getting the same grams of protein, the same grams of fat, and it's still going to be very different because the fatty acid profile of the fat's going to be different. And I'm guessing the amino acid profile might even be somewhat different in the protein itself. But the point is, like, they're different things. They're not interchangeable.
Yeah. The amino acid actually is not different.
It's not different. Okay.
No, it's so heavily genetically determined, the essential amino acid profile, that the leucine content, which is something that is of particular interest for the muscle anabolic response, leucine being a major anabolic trigger, one of the essential amino acids. It's actually around 8%. Regardless of whether the animal is grass-fed or grain-fed. And even the total essential amino acid profile, that's actually not much impacted. That is very much genetically determined. So the feeding practice. So the protein content is a little bit different. It's a few grams higher in grass fat, and the total fat is about 2 grams lower. But you do see a shift in the fatty acid profile, but not so much a shift in the actual amino acid profile. It's just higher because there's more protein.
Got it. So if you had 2 cuts of steak, one grain-fed, one grass-fed, and you cut them up so you're getting the same amount of the steak part, the muscle part with the protein, and the same amount in grams of the fat part, the major difference between the two would be more so in the fatty acid profile.
Yeah, and as a result, also the fat-soluble vitamin profile as well, where it may be a little bit more enriched in vitamin K, in vitamin E, in beta-carotene being the precursor to retinol. So that's where you see some of the differences. So in these fat-soluble nutrients as well. And also because they might, we know vitamin K1, right, is very rich in dark green leafy vegetables. Well, what is the cow's equivalent of a dark green leafy vegetable? It is their green forages that they consume. Also rich in carotenoids. Again, spinach is rich in carotenoids. Are there dark green leafy vegetables? Well, the cow is consuming that as well. So you see clearly these differences there occurring. You see difference in phytochemicals, and where there's not a lot of differences are actually in the B vitamins. In fact, you see that the B vitamins are a little bit higher in grain-fed beef, particularly B1 and B5, because they're rich in grains. And then also it's quite common to feed some vitamin and mineral supplements as well as part of the rations. So that is not a huge distinguishing feature. What we did find is that the zinc is a little bit higher in grass-fed animals. Things like copper are a little bit higher, but it's only 10 to 15% higher. So it's not a huge distinguishing feature. The main distinguishing features between a grass-fed and a grain-fed animal are fat-soluble vitamins, fatty acids, and then these phytonutrients.
Yeah. So just to summarize, The overall fat content grass-fed is going to be lower than in a grain-fed animal, but it will have a higher concentration of fat-soluble vitamins, things like vitamin A, vitamin E, vitamin K. In essence, the cow that's in the pasture eating grass, it's eating green vegetables, which have those fat-soluble vitamins. They're fat-soluble, so it's putting them in the fat it has. So there's basically a higher concentration, higher dose of those fat-soluble vitamins in the fat of the grass-fed pastured animal, even though it's got a little bit lower overall fat content than the grain-fed animal.
Yeah, but a lot of producers also are able to actually put fat on the animal quite well. So the absolute difference is only 2 grams in a ribeye steak. So it's like 14 grams versus or 12 grams versus 10 grams is roughly what we found. So the absolute difference is not huge. I mean, I know sometimes people maybe eat a grass-fed animal and have a poor eating experience because it's quite lean and probably the animal wasn't fattened up enough. But especially and we did a big profiling study called the Beef Nutrient Density Project together with the Bionutrient Institute, and we invited producers to submit samples. So a lot of grass-fed beef producers submitted samples, and definitely those ranchers, they were typically finishing animals on very biodiverse, highly productive pastures. So picture this as sort of this lush vegetation, a lot of rotational grazing. If you finish an animal on those type of pastures, it might actually put weight and fat on quite efficiently versus maybe an animal. And this is also what we found that are more on monoculture pastures or overgraze pastures where maybe which sometimes you see, right? Like picture sort of a pasture that looks like a golf course, right? And that's not really ideal for putting weight on an animal. But like I said, a lot of the producers, small scale producers, and I was very impressed with that study. And a lot of North American grass-fed beef producers are producing a very, very excellent product. And I do realize that our study was a little bit biased because the producers that thought that they were obviously,
they wanted to show off how good they were.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's what it was. So the producers that submitted were like, well, I'm doing these rotational grazing practices. I have like 40 plants on pasture. My animals are healthy. I think I'm producing a healthier product or a more nutritious product. I don't know, healthier, but a more nutritious product. And they would submit samples. And in many cases, or in almost all cases, that was definitely the case. They would be enriched in those aforementioned nutrients.
Yeah. So there's a distinction between grain-fed and grass-fed animals. There's also a distinction between monocrop and animals that are eating a more diverse set of grasses, right? One rancher could have a field that's got dozens and dozens of different plants, and they're out there and munching all of them. They're eating a more diverse, varied diet. And then another rancher could basically just have a field with one type of grass, and that's also going to introduce a difference. And all of this should be, I think, pretty intuitive to people. The stuff that the animal is eating is going to affect what's in its tissues, of course. For the animals that are eating grasses out in pasture, thinking about monocrop versus more diverse diets where they're rotating and they've got different plants that are available to the animals to eat, how does this affect the phytochemical profile? And maybe let's step back for a second. And when we say phytochemicals, plant chemicals, what exactly do we mean? And what are we talking about here in contrast to something like a macronutrient? How do you think about these things at a high level in terms of, the amount that is going to get ingested and the types of things that these chemicals tend to do as opposed to macronutrients?
Yeah, so I mean, they're basically anything that's not a vitamin or a mineral, right? So but these would be things like flavonoids, non-flavonoid polyphenols, such as still beans, which resveratrol would fall under, for instance, alkaloids, terpenes. These are plant secondary metabolites. And these compounds, they make up the vast majority of the plant, actually, both in oftentimes being very abundant in those, and also in terms of number of compounds. So it's kind of like, we have the macros, protein, carbohydrate, fat within the plant. We have vitamins and minerals, but then you got a lot of other nutrients in there, probably another. It's estimated in some cases that it's 30,000, 50,000 compounds that may be present in these plants beyond just the vitamins, minerals, and macros. And a lot of those compounds, at least in the context of a plant, they serve as responses to abiotic stresses. It could be the plant protecting itself from UV light, will start to produce more of those compounds from drought or maybe excess water availability, cold. They're natural pesticides and insecticides, right? The plant cannot run away, but doesn't want to get eaten by the worm either, or the caterpillar. So these are natural insecticides, pesticides, and really these compounds, because, well, we have been consuming those for a very long time. Ruminants have been consuming those for a very long time. And it seems like that these compounds, they would become metabolized, but then after that, they play roles as, in many cases, well, if we step back, they all have a hydroxyl group, and that makes them an antioxidant. So when we talk about these plant secondary compounds, in layman's terms, people consider them antioxidants. But they do more things than that, because people are, and also within our lab, we're finding out that these things may actually impact cognitive function. They can impact mTOR signaling pathways independent of amino acids. They may impact hepatic metabolism. They may impact pancreatic beta cells that produce insulin. So they also seem to be, they impact DNA and gene expression. So they also seem to act as signaling molecules besides their antioxidant effect. So, and what people, or at least, what has been found in studies, and this is a combination of in vitro work and also work in petri dishes, as well as human trials, that these have overall health promoting effects, and a diet that is rich in those is at least associated with a decreased risk of metabolic disease.
Yeah. So if we step back and think about this from the plant's perspective, the reason that many plants are often rich in things that we see are antioxidants is because the plant's actually using them as antioxidants. It's a protective thing. It's exposed to oxidative stress, just like animals are, just like we are. And so these things, and plants can't move, they can't run away like animals can. So they've got this very rich chemistry, which includes a lot of these antioxidant and other compounds. When we eat them, or when cows eat them, they can have antioxidant effects. So we just consume the antioxidants, and they can help buffer oxidative stress and stuff like that inside of us, because they are antioxidants at the chemical level. But some of them also do other things. They can act directly as signaling molecules to plug into various different pathways. They have a variety of effects. I think, yeah.
And none of them are all good. The dose is also important. If you consume very high levels of tannins, that can be quite detrimental to a cow. There's, for instance, what is known is if sheep are grazing a lot of clover, which is very rich in isoflavones, they have reproductive issues because of this high isoflavone intake. So it's also the dose is important. And maybe a little bit of a stress from the dose within us is also good. So again, it's a little more complex to state that all of these are antioxidants. They definitely may not all be that, and they may become pro-oxidants in very high doses. But yes, in general, there's the animal typically has post-ingestive feedback loops as well. I mean, it would overeat on the clover because there's nothing else, right? So because otherwise, between like not reproducing or dying, you choose for not dying. But if there's greater availability, then typically the post-ingestive feedback for the animal would say, like, I'm not going to consume super high levels of this plant because I know it doesn't make me feel good, because I can select for other plants as well. Or what is also really interesting on sort of this innate wisdom of animals is that if they have parasites, they might seek out certain plants and consume those in high quantities to get rid of that parasite. And really ensure that so they use them medicinally, prophylactically, to prevent the disease, medicinally after they have maybe things like parasites, and they may consume certain plants. So that's really interesting about animals as well, is that in many ways they are wiser than us, in that they select what's needed.
But at the end of the day, it's like what they're eating is, having effects on their body and their physiology and their brain and their tongues, ultimately, to say, oh, I need a little bit more of this and a little bit more of that. So they probably develop a taste for certain foods. And this can happen to us too. We often lose track of this today because our food supply is so abundant and we sort of always have everything. But, if you need amino acids, you will be more drawn to those savory flavors. If you need more other things, we know, in quite a bit of detail in animals, how the nervous system can tune the tastes of an animal to facilitate it eating or stop eating different things based on its nutrient requirements.
Yeah, and of course we have this in humans as well. Most you can see this in children, right? But maybe the most tactful one is, for instance, the British sailors that would sail across to the Caribbean, and they land, and they have this, if they were still alive and not die of scurvy, they have this ravenous appetite of consuming every citrus fruit in their sight, right? So it's still the human, or our bodies, we're just animals as well, still have this innate wisdom of our body telling us, or at least we start to have a craving for certain foods, or maybe during pregnancy, right, where maybe women might have a very strong desire for iron-rich foods. So we still have those mechanisms, but as you said, we did make it very hard on ourselves to be attuned with that because of our rich abundance of ultra-processed foods that actually may have that flavor, right, but not the nutrients that we think come with the flavor.
Right. Our brains evolved to sort of assume that certain flavors correspond to certain nutrient profiles. But, when we're engineering things in a lab, we can sort of break those associations so that we get the taste without what normally came with it. And so we end up eating things according to taste, but then our body doesn't get the nourishment it's expecting based on, the wisdom of the body that evolved.
Yeah, and what could play into that for sure, and it's an excellent point, Nick, what could play into that also is that what you see in animals, non-human animals, we're also animals, of course, in non-human animals, that they tend to overeat then in order to try to get those nutrients.
Right.
So it could also be, it's multifaceted, but probably, and we've seen this in some of the randomized control trials that we did, is that people on Standard American diets, they tend to eat more calories.
Right.
And it could be because it's highly palatable, but it could also be because they're overeating to try to get those nutrients in. And whereas maybe at a whole foods diet, you eat less because you have more nutrient density or more nutrients per unit calorie or per unit food.
Yeah. And there's actually lots of examples of this, some that I keep learning about. So, for example, our modern, what we call the Western diet, one of its salient characteristics to me is that it's very high in omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids. And there's at least a twofold problem there with respect to the overeating question is, one, these things become cannabinoids that actually promote more feeding and make food more palatable. So you've got a pathway to enhance palatability and incentivize the animal to eat more overall. But two, the type of macro profile you're eating can actually lead to micronutrient depletion. I just had someone on a couple of weeks ago, and we talked about how basically they were giving animals tallow versus soybean oil, and they both gained the same amount of weight. But the soybean oil animals that had a high omega-6 diet, for reasons I don't know if we understand, but they had vitamin B1 depletion in their liver. But the idea I want to get people thinking about here is you can get enough calories for energy to fuel, all of the energy requirements of your body. But if you're still deprived in certain nutrients that are acting as cofactors for enzymes or whatever, your body might say, well, why don't you continue being hungry so we can go out and try and get at least what we need there, even though then we're going to be overeating in terms of the total mass of consumption that we're putting in the body.
Yeah, no, and that's an excellent point. And, in terms of that depletion, we know a lot of B vitamins and fat-soluble vitamins, they indeed act as cofactors. A lot of them are involved in oxidative stress pathways. So if you may have more oxidative stress, you probably will also use them up more, right? That could be just one potential hypothesis. But yeah, it's an excellent point in the sense that the overeating part, in order to get the nutrients, you see this in other animals, you see this in livestock. There's no reason to think that we are any different, even though we sometimes like to convince ourselves that we are somehow some higher order of animals. But if we look at ourselves metabolically, we are just an animal like any other animal.
Yeah. And it's like there's this thing that happens with people. Obviously, humans are smart in a way that most or all animals aren't. We're smart enough that we can create food labs and make all of these new foods and understand the chemistry and recombine things in different ways. But we're not so smart that we understand how all these pieces evolved and fit together. And so we get in these situations where we're almost too smart for our own good. We've engineered all these amazing foods using our big brains, but we don't understand the full consequences of why the foods are packaged up in certain ways in nature and how it differs when we make them in from scratch using our ingenuity. And that can end up shooting us in the foot from a nutritional perspective.
Yeah, for sure. Because, and that's one thing we're now starting to learn about the complexity of foods, right? Because these ideas are still, and it still kind of persists today, is that, and for a long, I mean, I don't think we think that anymore, but for a long time we think, well, we polish the rice, the brown rice, right? Have white rice, and we have refined flour, we have white flour versus whole grain flour. All we're taking out is some minerals and vitamins, and we can just put those back. But that's not what we're taking out. We're taking out 20,000 other compounds probably as well. And that's one thing that we don't per se recognize. Another interesting, we have a relatively newborn, and it made me think about like sort of this idea of formula versus breast milk, right? The idea that at some point we as society were trying to convince that formula, which was scientifically formulated, was better than the real thing, breast milk. Yeah, it's I think what we can think of now laughable.
Yeah, it's like we've learned so much. Our knowledge keeps growing, but the surface area of our knowledge has gone up, and sometimes it's easy to think, oh, we kind of know, we figured most of it out. But there's so much complexity to biology. How would you say it? The surface area of our knowledge goes up, but so does the circumference of our ignorance. And if we forget, to remember how much we don't know yet,
it's like a Dunning-Kruger effect, right? You know a little bit, and then you consider yourself an expert, and as you know more, you realize that you don't really know anything.
Yeah. I want to ask you. So if we think about things like the dose of the nutrients that are in different foods, and we think about sort of animals in the food chain and the food web, right? You've got plants, and they're making their food from light. You've got animals that eat the plants. You've got animals that eat the animals that eat the plants. Some of those animals eat the animals that eat the plants and the plants. Some of them just eat other animals. So we've got this whole food chain, and this is affecting the dose and the pattern of nutrition that's going into an animal depending on where it sits in that food chain. On the topic of, so if we think about, say, a cow versus a human, the cow is this multi-chambered ruminant animal. It is built to eat only plants. It can go out in the pasture and eat all of these different grasses and stuff. If we were to go out and eat those grasses, we would not have a good time. We would get sick. We just wouldn't be able to do it. We wouldn't be able to extract all of the nutrients and filter out all of the toxins and things because we don't have the digestive apparatus that a cow has. So when we think about a human eating a cow that's been pastured, we talked about some of the nutrients that are inside that meat that we're getting. We're getting fatty acids, we're getting protein, we're getting phytochemicals and stuff. Can you talk a little bit about how ruminants and animals like that are actually filtering out stuff that would harm us or that we can't use, getting rid of plant toxins, sort of pre-digesting or transforming things that we would not be able to digest directly? What's going on there?
Yeah, no, for sure. And then, I do want to preface this by saying that definitely direct plant food consumption is a better source of phytonutrients. I want to highlight that, right? Like carrot is a better source of beta carotene than a cow, and a blueberry is a better source of anthocyanidins. But having said that, is that animals that graze forages that you and I cannot consume, and a lot of these compounds from that for plants with potential medicinal value that would otherwise not be able to consume or access, it's a way for the animal or the animal source foods to contribute additional unique metabolites to our diet. And one thing that, for instance, is really interesting is that a cow, being a mammal, it oftentimes transforms those compounds from plants that we cannot consume, that we cannot digest, into mammalian versions of antioxidants that we would directly consume, that in some cases, we don't have that same metabolic load on our liver, right? And so you already get sort of these pre-processed versions. What we're trying to understand now is there a benefit to that? If let's say we consume certain hydroxylated benzoic acids, certain hyporic acids, cinnamyl glycine, which is cinnamic acid bound to an amino acid glycine. How does that impact us? Because these are metabolites that we can see in the human as well,
Yeah.
particularly. So, and we see, for instance, in women that consume high levels of fruits and vegetables, you might see some of those metabolites, for instance, in breast milk. You see this in cow's milk as well. But what you see in cow's milk also are very unique metabolites that, to the best of our knowledge, and we wrote a review about it, that to the best of our knowledge have not been characterized within the human metabolome. But, well, you could argue that now they would be if you consume milk or meat from an animal in which that is in, but that are generally not, at least within metabolomics databases, characterized as being really present in humans. So when the animal, and for instance, one example is here, we work with a rancher here up in Idaho, and the animals would consume or have access on the mountain pastures to about 500 to 1,000 different plants over the growing season.
Yeah.
And it would select many different plants that we, with potential medicinal value, that it can extract those nutrients from the cell wall that we would otherwise not be able to extract it from, metabolize that, like you said, maybe there's other compounds in that could be potentially toxic to us, detoxify those, and we get an additional array of metabolites, oftentimes in pre-processed version. And the other thing of that is also, and I think this is really what the Italian and the French scientists have really appreciated, is that they studied these compounds also in the 90s and 2000s, thinking of that, how can we graze these animals through the Sardinian mountain pastures and alpine pastures and produce these cheeses with these very unique flavors coming from the plant chemistry. And so these are things that, besides, could have potential. They definitely have health benefits for the animal. They could have potential benefits as the consumer, but they also impact the flavor profile or the terroir of the food.
Right, right. Yeah. So, I mean, some of it's just the flavor. It's, you're going to be your experience eating it. But like the other thing that you mentioned here is when you're talking about a pastured animal on a diverse diet of different plants in the pasture, not only is that different from a monocrop pasture or a grain-fed animal in a feeding lot, but there's a seasonality aspect to this too. Like different plants are present in the pasture at different times of the year. And if the cow's grazing in the spring and then you harvest the cow, it's going to be a different end of product than if it's grazing a different time of the year. So there's just layer upon layer of complexity here.
Yeah, for sure, because you do kind of see that within, when animals come out of the dead of winter, the phytochemical richness of that product is a little bit lower than versus when it is on the grazing season. And I, growing up in the Netherlands, often drank farm fresh milk, and you could taste that. The milk that you got in the winter when the animals were on feed was not as complex as when you could taste the grasses in it. Essentially, the moment these animals were out on pasture, on the fresh spring grasses, the milk flavor would change immediately, and you would taste that. So it's certain that we can taste these things and result in flavor enhancement. But yeah, also the antioxidant value of that milk would go up at that point.
One of the things I want to ask you about too is, so on this topic of the compounds in foods getting sort of transformed as they move through the food chain. There's probably examples where, say, a plant might contain something that we can't digest, and the cow can, say, transform it into something that's actually an active metabolite inside of us that has nutritional value or that has some kind of medicinal value, has something good for us, basically. Yeah. Can you talk about some examples of that where, basically something like a cow is transforming something in a plant that's unusable to us directly into something that we can use? How common is that, and what are some examples?
Yeah, so I mean, we studied various metabolites, and some things that we really found. For instance, if you look at a compound like cinnamoyl glycine, which is cinnamic acid, it's rich in cinnamon, but it's rich in any green plant, really. So that's one compound, and it usually once they get metabolized through phase 1 and phase 2 metabolism in the gut and the liver of the animals, they get attached to a sugar, they get attached to a sulfate, they get attached to an amino acid because they are more stable that way. They like to seek a friend, and so you can see that transformation. Another thing that we're, for instance, finding, and that really helps also with authentication, is the compound called hyporic acid. Now, if you Google it, you would find a lot of associations with chronic kidney disease, but that's because if you do not excrete that metabolite or you have chronic kidney failure, you're unable to excrete the metabolite and you have it really go up very high. So that's why there's association. But it also goes up when we eat blueberries, for instance. So we not consider blueberries to be detrimental for your kidneys, right? So context matters is what I'm saying. But for instance, the compound hyporic acid, it's a sort of down in a benzoic acid is another dominant phenol within forage plants, and that gets metabolized all the way down to compounds such as hyporic acid. And you find that those levels go up quite a bit. But what you also find is some of these very unique hydroxylated benzoic acids that have clearly been modified by the animal, that could result in us providing some of those metabolites, and also certain isoflavone metabolites that we see that actually maybe transformed into things such as lignans. These are also key things that we see happening, where some of the isoflavones are actually biotransformed and may actually have less estrogenic effect as a result. Now, granted, again, this is a very nuanced topic because isoflavones actually can have also beneficial health effects. It's really
right. Depends on the dose, and the context. But is that why you mentioned earlier, like certain animals might eat certain, I don't know if it was clover or something else, but it's high in isoflavones, and that's why they can actually have reproductive issues?
Well, yeah, but this is more like in the terms of a monoculture pasture, right? Like you're a sheep, and there's a clover monoculture, and you end up having to, you consume a bunch of clover. So you see that too. It would be in the humans potentially as well. Let's say I pound a bunch of soy each and every day, soy milk, tofu, like so protein isolate, and it's just like a very high level, right? Then maybe I could.
Yeah, but what you're basically, the reason for that is some of these plant-derived compounds are estrogenic. In this case, they are interacting with the estrogen systems in our bodies, and at a high enough dose, they're going to have measurable effects.
Yeah, they're going to have measurable effects, and another thing that we're seeing is that some of those it might take some of these hydroxyl groups from various compounds, turn them into another compound that we can use that is very much in the metabolite that we find with us in the mammal. So the way I see it is that animals on grass-fed or on diverse pastures, it's another avenue to obtain both unique metabolites as well as increase the overall phytochemical richness of our diet, when done in conjunction with a diverse number of plant foods. That's really the way that I see it.
The other thing I want to ask you about is the distinction between real beef and plant-based alternatives. So, for example, I know that you've done work where you looked at metabolomics. You measured the stuff inside grass-fed ground beef from a cow versus plant-based alternatives. So things that are supposed to be alternatives to the grass-fed beef if you don't want to eat animals. So this stuff is out there. Some people prefer one, some people prefer the other. From a metabolomics perspective, the nutrient content, the phytochemical content, all that stuff, what have you guys seen in the lab in terms of the chemical differences between grass-fed ground beef and plant-based alternatives?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the broader nutrient or metabolome profile, there's a day and night difference. It's as different as you consider a plant and an animal to be.
So, right? So it's labeled as, they're both labeled as ground beef or the ground beef alternative, but from a metabolomics and nutrient perspective, they are completely distinct things. Yeah,
they're completely distinctive. I mean, on the surface level, by using isolated plant proteins and using things like coconut oil, sunflower oil, right? You can get the saturated fat and the total fat the same. You can get the protein content the same. You add synthetic vitamins and minerals, and then the vitamin and mineral content will look the same. But that's about where it stops, right? So on the surface level, you can make a nutrition facts panel look the same. But then if you look at the other number of compounds in there, yeah, they're day and night difference. They're absolutely not comparable, and I think that's important for people to know. That it reminded me a little bit of that. There was this meme, I think, during that time where some butcher had created a turkey or ground turkey that looked like a carrot, and maybe it contained a little bit of beta carotene, but ground turkey is a poor substitute for a carrot, and I would say the other way around. If you go beyond just protein content and a handful of vitamins and minerals, a plant-based meat alternative is not a bona fide substitute for meat, nutritionally speaking.
Yeah, and just to riff on what we were talking about before about the how important the food matrix is and how context dependent all this stuff is. Even if you took the equivalent, the things that are equivalent between the plant-based ground beef and the actual ground beef, maybe they have the exact same vitamin B1 content, maybe they have the exact same mass of amino acids, but the amount that your body can absorb will plausibly be very different because of the whole sort of food matrix that the stuff is embedded in. And so just because the label says 5 grams of this and 5 grams of this doesn't mean you're actually going to extract all of that, or that your body will actually see that equivalent.
Yeah, that's right. That's another point indeed, because usually you see it when you have vitamins and minerals and they come in a complex whole food matrix. The uptake is typically greater. The bioavailability is greater than what you would expect by just looking at those contents. A really interesting thing is for instance, what's called authors wrote about this a few years ago called the meat factor. These are more or less unidentified factors within meat that can actually result or enhance the uptake of things like zinc and iron and choline. So these are cofactors that actually result in an uptake greater. So they're kind of like chaperones or facilitators of that, right? And that's why you get it within a complex whole food matrix. You typically see that 1 + 1 is 3, or you get more bang for your buck. And what's really, really interesting, and I think this speaks to sort of this synergy in omnivorous diets within humans, is that if we eat beef with beans, we might actually have a higher uptake of the zinc and the non-heme iron from the beans, because there's these cofactors within beef that actually result in an uptake, right? And what we talked about earlier is that maybe some of those compounds if you have chili with beans in them, or maybe you throw some parsley in it, is that those compounds might actually negate some of what we think of negatives within the meat. So if you look at me as a human, or from a human nutrition standpoint, I think there's many benefits to be obtained from animal source foods and plant source foods, because they have, while there's also overlap, they also have very unique metabolites. And if you're from a sensory perspective, and I realize this is subjective, if you want to, you're not eating meat, but you want to have sort of this mouthfeel and taste of a hamburger, that's the reason to consume a plant-based meat alternative designed to mimic meat. But from a nutritional standpoint, yeah, it's important that people realize that this is not a one-to-one replacement.
What about milk? So and it's very intuitive. You mentioned earlier that obviously a grain-fed animal, a grass-fed animal, they're going to be different in terms of their milk as well, not just their meat. I want to ask you in particular about raw versus pasteurized milk from a metabolomics, nutrient content, phytochemical perspective. Obviously, there's we can talk about, infection probability and, things can go bad. Something that's fresh and nutritious can go bad, of course, and how fresh and how nutritious it is will affect how quickly it goes bad. But from a metabolomics and nutrient and phytochemical perspective, what is pasteurization doing to raw milk, and what might people want to know there?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, indeed, it gets rid of any bacterial contamination, right? And but from a strict nutritional perspective, is that these plant secondary metabolites, these phytonutrients, as well as certain fat-soluble metabolites, they're quite heat-labile, meaning that they do not withstand heat very well. So what you do see, and we've done some just internal work, but there's also published literature out there. Again, a lot of it from European literature that has studied, and I also know a group out of Mexico that has studied this, pasteurized versus unpasteurized milk, or cheese made from pasteurized versus unpasteurized milk. And what you see is that you see a reduction in these phytonutrients. And this is oftentimes why it is considered blasphemy, probably in France and in Italy, right, to pasteurize your milk prior to making pecorino cheese or prior to making these alpine cheeses, because you're going to end up with something that tastes flatter, because you lowered the level of phytochemicals. So you can taste that in that, and that's oftentimes the reason why the French and Italians do not pasteurize their cheeses.
Got it. So basically, pasteurization is going to destroy or alter the structure of various components that are in there, and that's going to change its nutrient profile. It's going to change the way it tastes, and all of these things.
Yeah, that's right. But yeah, I mean, if an animal produces milk that, and this is also just the way that we have set up our system here, right? In the sense that if we prior to maybe where we had more confined feeding operations, I mean, pasteurization really in the 1900s, early in the 1900s came in to play, and particularly really interesting literature on this is that the animals were fed in very confined situations, right? And were fed like, things like distiller's grain and things such as that, right? And the animals would develop infectious diseases and get milk maybe that was not per se that safe to consume for humans. So if you're, and right now we're obviously at the place where it's like any type of, and certainly we've gone a long way, even in zero grazing systems now, right? In confined feeding systems, where I wouldn't say that this is per se a non-safe environment, but obviously there is a little bit of a greater risk potentially. But if you have healthier animals, right, healthy animals, then yeah, the risk of it might be there. I mean, it's usually also can be that it usually might enter the system through maybe the way you milk the animal, right, or whatever, that's done hygienically and things such as that. But yeah, I mean, I'm from Europe, and I must admit that there's a much bigger taboo on consuming raw milk here than there is in Europe. Because I was, for instance, in Croatia this summer, and middle downtown, and we had it in my town when I'm from the Netherlands too, is that you had these milk taps. So farmers would just have a milk tap, and you could go there and just pull in some coins or your credit card, and you could buy raw milk directly from the farmer. I was actually in Croatia, in the middle of downtown Zagreb, quite a big city, and they had a milk tap like that too, where you could just, it says on no risk, but I mean, yeah, it's quite common in countries like Switzerland as well. Whereas here, I think it's up and coming though, for sure. I mean, I think people are more interested in it for sure. I don't know if it's healthier, but there's definitely a difference in flavor profile.
Yeah. So whatever the answer is in terms of metabolic health, nutrition, like they're different. It's a different cocktail of things are going to be in there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the metabolome profile of raw versus pasteurized milk is different. Yes.
What about, so in general, inflation is an issue. People are, have limited budgets. In general, I'm guessing pasture raised grass fed products are going to be more expensive because it just takes longer, it takes more effort to produce those animals than it is having them on a feedlot eating the cheapest possible grains available. What are ways that people can consume these things on a budget, can get more grass-fed pastured animal products? Is there just fundamentally going to be a huge price difference there, or are there products that are comparable that would still work for a budget conscious person?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a higher price point to it, and you could argue that in the many cases of the pastured animals, the farmer gets a fairer price for its product, right, and can actually make a decent living. Yeah, it's true that it is more expensive. I mean, it is definitely something that one can grapple with. I always think about it, but this becomes then a bigger picture discussion, but maybe it's good to have a bigger picture discussion. It's sort of this idea of the true cost of food, or where your priorities should be, right? Which is like, if you are able to spend a little bit more on your health on the food side of things rather than elsewhere in life, right? And it also, as a society, is sort of the true cost of food, is that on my grocery bill, I do not see the cost that it is to maybe clean up waterways, to clean up lands, right? To the healthcare bill, right? But these are paid elsewhere as a society. So on a societal level, we can certainly do something about that. But then, as a personal level as well, is that, yeah, I don't know. As a college student, I didn't have a lot of money, but I still made it priority to spend more money on my food than I did on my iPhone or going out, because I knew I would feel better, I would be more productive, and I'd have more opportunity in the future. Now, granted that I know that's easy for me to say also, of course, right? Because there's maybe scenarios also where it's really hard due to your socioeconomic status. You're on food stamps, you do not have availability to that. I always bought a big freezer so I could buy a quarter of a cow, and then actually it becomes quite economical, right?
Yeah, that's what I do actually, yeah.
Yeah, and then buy mostly ground beef. And I know it's like when I was a college student in the Netherlands, I was buying horse meat because from old racehorses that people usually took care of quite well, but they were, but they sold them cheaper than beef, right? So it's like there's other ways that maybe you can do this, but yeah, you have to prioritize your health and then assume that by feeling better, by being more productive, you will be able to perform better in life, and therefore, do not, if you have suffered from metabolic health. So it's also things of priority, right? In the U.S. as a society, I think, I don't know the stat by head, but I think it's like we spend about 10 to 15% of our income on food, and it used to be very common for it to be 30%, and usually other societies, it's very common that food is it's almost the most important thing, right? And here we like it as cheap as possible, and
which leaves more left over for gadgets and toys and stuff.
Yeah, that's right. But you'll if you the ironic thing about that is if you feel healthier, if you feel you can think about the lost hours of productivity due to that we have in the US because of just unhealthy lifestyles, right? Like think about it, how much probably could make that back as a society in terms of productivity. So, but these are things that I'm not saying that this is the responsibilities with the individual, because it is really hard as an individual to eat healthy, right? And if I buy cookies and put them in my office, I'm going to eat those cookies. That's just the way it is. So I don't buy them, but but as a society, right, or the way that we set up our food supply, yeah, we do make it really hard on ourselves.
What's some of the stuff you guys are working on today that's fairly far along that we might see you publish on in the next 6-12 months or so? Things that you're excited about that you think are going to be interesting for people?
Yeah, so I think what's really interesting to people is that the study that we did comparing pasture finished versus feedlot finished animal sourced foods, and the finding that you can actually lower your omega-6 to 3 ratio in your red blood cells quite a bit within your body from just eating pastured animal source foods. I think people will find that a really interesting finding, because that challenges the notion a little bit that this omega-3s in pastured animal foods don't matter, which is really interesting anyway, because we're not the first ones to show that at all. There's a good amount of literature from studies in the UK and Australia that already found that, but we're one of the earlier ones in North America. And we also did a very long study on that, so that also gave us a stronger effect. We definitely did 16 weeks is one of the longest studies. So I think that would be a very interesting one. Another interesting one that we're publishing is it actually got published recently, but there will be a follow-up paper. But from the Beef Nutrient Density Project, and this paper was published last year around Christmas, where we profiled the North American beef supply chain, so grass-fed animals, grain-fed animals, and looked at this. We just saw these incredible variations, particularly in grass-fed beef. Some of these variation in nutrients might be 5x, 10x. Wow. Right? So, yeah, so it's really a little bit of a Wild West. And what we did find is that higher nutrient density or was associated with more plant diversity. And that was also the only thing that really shook out that was correlated. So plant diversity and not overgrazing. So that regular movement, which we think is not the movement, is just a proxy of like not overgrazing your fields. So that's what we found, and that's another studies coming up. We also start to move more with our metabolomics profiling also into plant foods, into different crops. So there will be some work coming out on that, on beets. We did berries. We've done grains. So that work is also in coming up. And one thing that I'm also really excited about is that we work directly with farmers a lot. And so we're launching this an interactive dashboard through our website, the Center for Human Nutrition Studies, where people can view their data in an interactive dashboard compared to other foods and things such as that. Just to like I said, we have a lot of that came out of those. We get a lot of requests initially based on our work for food nutrient density testing from farmers. So that kind of came out of our work. So we've been kind of scaling that up, and it's been really beneficial because we hope the farmer benefits from the data and help that, but also by gathering more data sets, right? We also are able to raise more awareness, publications, and hopefully over time, at least. There's a contribution to food policy, right? That shift is like, hey, how you raise an animal or how you grow your food actually has a meaningful impact. So broccoli A is not the same as broccoli B and not the same as broccoli C. And how you grow that broccoli actually matters. And it may matter for our health. And so those are the type of profiling studies that we're doing at the moment as well.
All right, Stephan. Well, this is really great stuff. I love your work and I love what you're doing. It's really interesting from sort of just a science nerd perspective, but also it's very practical and useful. Obviously, just all of the stuff that you do, actually looking what's in food. And I loved what you said earlier about how you guys actually measure the stuff, and you're actually doing clinical trials. You can't infer everything from a spreadsheet, and if you do, you're probably going to be wrong a lot.
Yeah, that's right. It's and I don't quite know how we're gonna put this on a nutrition facts panel, but at least by having people realize that or having that awareness, consumers can make informed decisions on the food that they purchase and at least increase the transparency.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's worth thinking about. I look at the nutrition facts, but also I just sometimes look at, like, if I go buy ground beef at the store, I'm going to get the grass-fed I'm going to get the grass-fed pastured animal, not the other one. And I'm not saying don't look at the nutrition facts, but almost like that to me, for my life, that's the more important thing. And in a way, that's kind of convenient because if you know some of this stuff, I can be like, look, I want the grass-fed pastured animal. I don't need to sit down and try and analyze every nutrient on the nutrition label. I know that there's going to be this pretty major basic difference between the one raised this way and the one raised that way. And it actually just saves me time and effort.
Yeah, that's right. And if you consume these things as a whole foods diet as well, right? Like some of those nuances of people worrying about saturated fat content or things like that. I'm not saying you shouldn't worry about it, but my point being is that we know that if you consume whole foods like cheeses, right, that are from maybe pasture-raised animals, right? It's coming back about some of we produce excellent pasture grass-fed cheeses here as well, or even cheeses that are maybe from a zero grading system where animals are fed proportionally more forages. You get a healthier saturated fatty acid profile, and if you consume that cheese with as part of a healthy diet, like this stressing about like the nutrition facts panel and says, oh, this much of my daily value for like these things become less critical, I would say, because your overall diet quality just matters so much. And unless I'm not saying it's like eating tablespoons of butter every day. That's not what we're seeing. We're talking about this in support of more of a context of a whole foods based diet. But then you probably don't need to stress as much about these minute details as well, and can just enjoy your whole foods based diet that is enriched in helper hormone compounds, enriched in flavor compounds, and sort of feel that nourishment that. Like I said, it may sound a little woo-woo, and it's hard to study that, right? But what we can see on paper is that, with enhancement of these flavor metabolites, and then wedding that to animal work, where you see greater satiety, that these things are all, I think, key parts to take into account, and maybe even the overall lifestyle that if you eat healthy whole foods diet, maybe it motivates you to go on a walk now. It's sunny, so I might go on a walk after this for a little bit, right? And refresh a little bit, and then I'll be more productive afterwards, and have a healthy lunch. And these are all things that just play into sort of the lifestyle. So I think that's key. That food is not just nutrients; it has value much more beyond that.
All right. Well, Professor Stephan van Vliet, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Nick.
Visit mindandmatter.substack.com to find all of my content. Hey everyone, a great way to support my efforts is to visit my support page at mindandmatter.substack.com. A link to that page is in the episode description, or you can search for it on the Substack page itself. The support page has an up-to-date list of my affiliate partners. These are companies I work with, and if you buy those products through those links or using the discount codes provided, those will get you a great deal on a variety of products related to optimizing physical, metabolic, or mental health and vitality. These are all products I use myself, and some of them are directly related to podcast episodes or formulated by Mind and Matter guests. For example, there's a great product called Keto Citra, formulated by a kidney biologist who is on episode number 186. It contains the ketone body BHB together with several minerals in a precise ratio, formulated with kidney health in mind. There are also links to products like physical technology devices to track your metabolic health, digital applications to help you find and learn about food and consumer products, and more. One product I use every day is the AquaTrue water filter. I recommend this to everyone because it gets everything out of your drinking water: heavy metals, microbes, endocrine disruptors, microplastics, you name it. Other charcoal or gravity-based filters that a lot of people use don't get everything out, they just get some of the stuff out. So I really like the AquaTrue product. You can look for a link to my affiliate partners on my support page or directly in the episode description to this episode, or you can go to mindandmatter.substack.com to find it there.